Discussion topic. Do you need to min-max to play World of Warcraft? The answer to this question may shock you, in that it's like, it really depends. If you're a world-first pushing guild, or just, a mythic guild that tries to clear out their current raid tier before the next one comes out, the answer is yes. You need to min-max. Otherwise, you're kind of pulling down the rest of your raid. It's kind of just like an expectation that everyone should min-max in those kinds of settings. Same thing with like people who push Mythic plus Dungeons at the highest level, or people who PvP, or do any kind of high endgame content type of raiding. However, the amount of people who clear high-level Mythic bosses, or, get high-level PvP stuff, they make up less than 1% of the people who play the game. If you watch my video on the top 10 hardest raid bosses, the remake one, I go over like statistics on how many people actually downed a lot of the bosses. Mythic Blackhand, for example, made it to the list of being one of the hardest raid bosses of all time, even though it was cleared pretty quickly, because so few people actually managed to clear it while it was current content. And it had like one of the least amount of clears out of any endgame boss in the game, as it was like 0.2% of people. It was less than half of a percent of players were able to clear Mythic Blackhand. It was kind of insane. And then if you go over to Heroic Lich King, for example, another really hard boss that made the list, it had a 1.5% clear rate, or something like that. And then Mythic Kil'jaeden had a 2% clear rate, even though it was one of the hardest raid bosses of all time. Mainly because they nerfed it so heavily afterwards. And even after then, it was only just like 2%, and that was actually kind of high. Most people don't clear high-level Mythic raids, so most people don't need to min-max. And yet, it's incredibly prevalent to the point where everyone is basically expecting everyone else to min-max. And if you don't min-max, then you're doing something wrong. That being said, just because you're playing at lower tiers of level of play doesn't mean, min-maxing is useless. Like, if I were to try to, help out a fellow guild member, even though we raid very casually, I would probably suggest to min-max their gear and, like, rotation and everything. If I was going to give advice to new players, I'd probably tell them to min-max. But here's the thing with min-maxing. Like, most people don't need to do it. You don't need to min-max in order to clear, like, Heroic Azara of the current raid tier. You basically, if you know how to play your class to an acceptable level, you and your raid team should be able to clear ahead of the curve achievement, no problem. Just as long as you get enough gear to compensate. You don't need to worry about which stats are the best, or if your benthic gear has a gem slot on it or not, because it doesn't matter at lower levels of play. It's a big deal at the cutting edge where everyone's playing their class perfectly, but, there's a high chance you're not playing your class perfectly. I don't play my class perfectly, and I've been playing it for years, and I like to consider myself a good player. Mainly because I've seen people who play my class at the top level, and I think, my god, that is some skillful play. Mainly because I play a really high skill cap class, the Disc Priest. The better you are, the more healing you'll do. Kind of. It's not even that. Disc Priest is more complicated than that. The reason it's brought along is because it can do damage and heal at the same time. So it's more about maximizing your damage than it is really maximizing healing. But you also do have to heal. It's a complicated thing. Min-maxing, honestly, not super important for healers or my Disc Priests. But unless you're at the highest level of play. Because the amount of skill that goes into it kind of negates that kind of thing. Like, I'm talking in circles right now, so let me give an example. Back in Wrath of the Lich King, a very prominent hunter that I used to follow named Frostheim, he wrote an article that was about, I forget what it was called. I think it was like the DPS of skill. Hunters back then were very reliant on their global cooldown because they had a 1.5 second global cooldown back then. Nowadays, they have the regular, haste can reduce it to 1 second type thing. Or I think it's even just set at 1 second. But it used to be a 1.5 second global cooldown, which is like the slowest one. I think only like tanks. There's very few classes that still have a set 1.5 second global cooldown. Most of them are like 1 to 1.5 seconds. Anyways, the Hunter itself back then didn't have the focus systems. They were all about mana. And because they're all about mana, they basically just used whatever abilities were off cooldown. And if an ability wasn't off cooldown, they would just spam their filler ability. And that was basically their rotation. And because, you can only use one of your abilities every 1.5 seconds, you had to make sure to always get off one ability every 1.5 seconds. And then that's where he went into the math. He's like, if a hunter misses one shot, if they miss a single global cooldown because they had to run out of the fire, they had to click on an ability, just something happens in the raid, they have to do an objective, they have to swap to ads, and, they don't time it well enough, so they miss a global cooldown. And then he did the math for it, and basically, the amount of DPS you lose for missing that one global cooldown was the equivalent to showing up with raids without a flask, without potions, without gems on your gear, back when that mattered a lot more, without any enchants, back when you could enchant every piece of your gear. And I think it even came to the point where it's even not having any buffs from any of the other classes, when that used to be a big deal. Because back in Wrath of the Lich King, if you had a full raid team with a whole bunch of different buffs, you just did so much more damage because there were so many buffs in the game back then. But you basically lost all of that advantage if you missed a single global cooldown. And most people miss way more than one. In an average raid fight, in an average raid, you're going to miss global cooldowns. Even top players, in Method or something, they miss global cooldowns every now and then. But what kind of separates them is that they rarely miss them. They optimize their play to the point where they'll stop in the middle of running to an objective in order to get off one more global cooldown, and then they stutter step. It's high-level play stuff. You don't see that at lower levels of play. Most people don't even know that's even a thing. I remember I was watching one of the Method healers go over their mythic Unat strategies. And he's like, see, at this point right here, the timer's at this thing. So I start running over here with Penance because I can use it while moving. And then I stand still in order to cast off a smite. And then I run over during the 1.2 seconds it takes for it to recharge. And then I cast another one. And he basically talked about how he was getting to the objective while not missing a single global cooldown. Because he didn't have nothing but instant casts. He also timed his instant cast so he wouldn't have to stop as much. That's high-level skills of play where min-maxing matters. Because if you're playing your class to the maximum efficiency, then yes, min-maxing is going to allow you to separate yourself from everyone else. Because you're already playing at the best, and then that's when, having the right gem slot in your Benthic gear, or having rings that have your 2 best stats on it, matter a lot more than, anything else. But on lower levels of play, most people, they miss those global cooldowns. They're not playing optimally. They're probably not even doing their rotation correctly. And yet they're also the same people who will pay raid bots, so they can min-max their gear quicker and skip the queue. I think it's raid bots, right? If you subscribe to their Patreon, they allow you to skip the queue to min-max your gear better. Those kinds of people are also not the ones, they're not mythic raiders. They're not playing at the top levels of gear. The mythic raiders, the top mythic raiders, they have different problems from heroic clears or normal clears or people who just pug raids. At medium levels of play, min-maxing doesn't really matter, but it can still give you an edge. If you have all of the best gear, everything's maximized to the best efficiency, it's still going to give you a baseline higher level of damage or healing or survivability than it would be someone else who just puts on whatever. But if someone just puts on whatever and they're playing their class perfectly, they're going to do better than you. Because the skill of the play just matters that much more. I'm not sure if it's still the same thing. Like, the example with the hunter missing a global cooldown and it costing them, basically showing up to raid without any extra enchants, gems, or gear or buffs. I don't think it's that bad because that was specific to hunters at that time when one global cooldown mattered a lot to them. It's not as big of a deal to them right now. They'd probably have to miss a couple of global cooldowns for it to be that drastic, but I don't know. I don't think it's really that many. Like, it probably is just 2 now. Probably just missing 2 global cooldowns is the equivalent to not showing up to raid with optimized gear. But most people don't know this. And there's a huge culture of min-maxing. Because if your gear is min-max, you'll do the more damage. This should really be about, playing your class to the best. Everyone already assumes they're doing that. That's not even really a thing. You kind of just assume you're playing to the best, and then you also need to min-max. That's fine. The problem with min-maxing, though, is people basically complain about the game because of min-maxing. Like, Classic WoW is a great example. The best way to farm honor was to basically form death squads and just camp people at flight points. That's like the min-max way to do it. It's not fun for anyone involved, but that's the best possible way to do it. Or in Alterac Valley, the most optimal way to farm rep is to just rush the boss and kill it. It's not very fun, but it's optimal. The most optimal way to do dungeons is to bring a whole bunch of mages to AoE cleave everything. So lots of other classes don't really get to play, or, they're not invited as much. The most optimal way to level up is to skip quests and just grind dungeons. I don't know if optimal is really the same as min-maxing, but they're pretty close. The optimal way to play is generally not the fun way to play. And people will, complain about the game based on the fact that they're min-maxing and they're ruining their own fun for themselves. But so many other people are doing it as well that it's kind of like a widespread problem. So many people think they need to min-max, and min-maxing just kind of lowers the fun of the game. And it kind of ruins it for everyone else, to an extent. Not everyone does this. There's lots of people who don't min-max as well, because, it doesn't really matter. And also, this does transfer over into the live version of the game, too, with gear and everything. Like, when they announced corrupted gear, I remember Preach made a video talking about how bad it was for min-max reasons, and then lots of people agreed, everyone was complaining about it. That's true if you're a min-maxer. However, if you're not like a top progressed raid guild, that stuff doesn't matter. Like, it's not a big deal to the average player. It's just kind of like a fun little corrupted system. That's not really a big deal, but it does cause some headaches for min-maxers. And that's why he was complaining, because he is, a mythic level raider. But then everyone else complained about it as well, as if they were mythic level raiders. It doesn't matter to them as much. I have to put little caveats on this, because people like to take, absolutes and then nitpick the hell out of them. So I'm trying my best. But basically, Titan forging, big problem for min-maxers, top level raiders. Not a big deal for lower levels of play, because if you get a Titan Forge piece of gear in a LFR dungeon, it'll be as good as a mythic level piece of gear. And it's like, neat. Now you're a tiny bit stronger. It causes problems at the higher end, though, for min-maxers and stuff. Or, for Azeroth traits and everything. They do something on it, and you don't know which ones are the best, so you have to, min-max it out to find out which ones are the absolute best for your class. So then you just start stacking all of the best traits. Nothing really wrong with that. I'm just saying, this is what people do, and then they get mad at Blizzard because they have to do this. They kind of put it upon themselves to only chase after these one little pieces of Azerite traits because that's the min-max best one for them. Because it's like, 2% better than the second best choice. And that means they'll never pick the second best choice because it's 2% worse. When really the difference isn't that big of a deal. If you look at like top performing DPSs and then like compare them to each other, they're within 10% of each other. Like the highest one is within 10% of the lowest one, which is really good balance. And then it gets skewed as the raid goes on because everyone will start playing that 10% higher class. And then it gets, all of the skilled people are playing technically the best class. And then everyone who just kind of likes the class probably aren't the best players in the world. So it gives them a worse representation on the charts. And in Blizzard's, internal development, they're like, yeah, our class right here, it shows these are all performing within the margin of error with each other. It's not a big deal. Some of them are performing a little bit better in some fights, but generally they're all balanced against each other if they're playing their class optimally. But if you look at the charts later on, it shows a different story. It'll show like all the survival hunters doing really low damage, only because there's not a lot of people playing them. And the people who are playing them just because they really like that style of play or that class. And they weren't going to switch no matter what, but they also probably aren't the best players in the world. So it gives them a much more skewed perspective. Like in my raid team, for example, all we do is clear up to the heroic boss of the expansion, and then we're basically done. That's pretty casual levels of raiding. But we have a lot of good people in our group, so we finish really quickly every raid tier. And like one of our top DPS is an enhancement shaman, which is generally laughed about, at the rest of the community, because that's kind of like this, nobody wants to play an enhanced shaman. They're like one of the worst DPS, but they're not. They're within like 10% of the best, unless the best is really overpowered. That does happen sometimes. But they're balanced against everything else pretty well. There are some other video games where the balance is nowhere near as good. But, most people probably don't play those other ones. I don't play those other ones. I just hear people complaining about them in comparison to WoW, so my information's probably wrong too. But if you're good, and you'll do good DPS, that's basically it. It doesn't really matter what spec you play. Some of them definitely do perform better though. But you can still perform better than someone who's not as good and they're playing the best class. There's also lots of example of people who have like BIS gear and they perform worse than everyone else in the raid team just because they're not very good. That all being said, the fact that they have BIS gear means they're probably still above the tanks at least. As long as you can out DPS the tanks, you're good to go. So, anyways, this is pretty long-winded. In conclusion, this is a discussion topic. This isn't me just telling you shouldn't min-max, it's wrong. Because I would definitely suggest someone to min-max their gear or their rotation if they're having problems. That's a really good way to increase your DPS, or healing, or, damage mitigation or whatever. But I also don't think it's super necessary unless you're playing at high levels of gear. Like most of the time, I kind of just put on whatever the highest item level gear I have, unless I know like, hey, this piece has really good stats for my class. I'm definitely going to keep wearing it even though it's a little bit less item level. Or I won't go out of my way to get sockets on, benthic gear. But I got lucky and got them anyway. If I hadn't gotten lucky and got sockets on all my benthic gear, I don't know if I would have kept re-rolling just to try to get it. Because technically it is more damage. But also, the reason you're wearing it is for those really good, like, secondary effects on them. Not the socket, which technically gives you a little bit more. It's just not a big deal. And I still perform really well. Because I like to think, I'm a decently good player. I still look up, how to best heal during certain parts of a fight, which matters a lot more than having the best stat on every piece of gear. And also, Disc Priests, they don't really have BIS Azerite traits anyway. If you go on, like, Warcraft logs, and then look at all the best disc priests and compare them against each other, there is just a mismatch, an amalgamation of different Azerite traits for like all of the toppers. There isn't really a best. People just kind of use whatever. Just because most of them aren't very good. So, if all of them are kind of bad, you can just kind of pick whichever one you like. Unlike, the Shadow Priest, for example, where 2 of them are absolutely the best. So you want those 2 on like every piece of gear, except for 2 of them where you just want one-offs. It's a little bit different for DPS classes. Healers are a little bit more flexible when it comes to these kinds of things. Anyways, that's the discussion. What do you think? Why do you think I'm wrong about this? How wrong am I? Am I the most wrong person in the world? Cool thing about these discussion videos is sometimes people give me really good reasons about why my whole topic is wrong, and I'll agree with them. It doesn't happen very often. I generally pick topics that I'm, confident about. This one isn't one of those. It's more of a discussion on like, hey, you don't really need to min-max. However, it does help you out. So, it's not really, I'm not taking a hard stance on this. Mainly because I would probably suggest to people to increase their DPS as well. So, leave your comments down below, just discussing this topic, and I'll read some of them in the response video, maybe next week.